Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Angela Garcia, professor of anthropology at Stanford University.
Thank you so much, Prof. We've just had a ghost in the machine claiming to be your note taker, but we've sent the ghost. We don't know if it's female, male, indeterminate, as it were, mixed, out of the room. But it took a
Right.
bit of a struggle, didn't it, Prof?
It did. Yes, something I had never encountered before, but I'm glad that you were able to get them out.
We've probably all got a note taker somewhere within us.
Mhm.
Malinowski did.
He did indeed. And I have notebooks all over my desk that are half filled, and I don't remember which is, for what subject, but I am a big fan of notebooks and pens and things of that nature.
Wonderful. Now, before we get on to my stereotypical question I pose to everybody, how many pens do you take with you on an excursion in the field? Do you have a backup, or is it just one, or do you have
Yes. Oh,
four?
no. I
And what
have at
happens when
least.
they leak?
Oh, well, usually my pens don't leak, but I don't use a fountain pen, although I do have a few fountain pens. But I usually have about five with me at any given time in a little pouch that is very cute. And I carry my pens around with me in my chapstick.
I once was given a driving fine, quite undeserved, for $34. And I didn't know how much it would be, so I had my checkbook and my pen with me. I was in a suit with a tie. I took out the checkbook and the pen in front of the court, and the pen had leaked throughout my jacket.
Oh,
And
no.
I was unable to write $34 on the check.
Oh, no. What a day.
The court took a certain pity on me. But, Prof, enough of my exciting adventures. We're here to talk about your work. And I'd like to begin that, now that we've gotten the note taking out of our system, as it were, with the query as to what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you.
Oh boy. Well, I look around it, Stanford's academic year just came to an end only a few days ago, and I'm incredibly excited to get back to reading books, fiction, mostly. And so I have all of these books that I've bought over the course of the year, and I'm just really excited. I'm looking at them now. I'm very excited to dig in over the summer and to begin reading again for pleasure. So that has um, gotten me very excited. And I guess one other thing that I've been thinking a lot about, which is undocumented people living in this country and the kinds of violences that they're exposed to on a daily basis. So I've been writing a lot about that. I just wrote an op-ed about this, the status, particularly of undocumented Mexicans living in California. So in addition to my excitement about reading, I'm frustrated, angry, despairing about the status of our immigration system and the way that we're treating undocumented people in this country. It's shameful.
So, following up on the first part, are these books things that will be categorized if there were still things called bookstores or if people went to libraries as fiction or literature?
Good question. I think it's a combination of literature, as you say. So I've been reading a lot of the work of Thomas Mann, become very obsessed with Thomas Mann. I think that that would constitute literature.
Oh, yes.
I also have my daughter just bought me for my birthday Patti Smith's new memoir, so I'm very excited to read her new memoir. Um, a little bit of critical theory that I'll be reading, but mostly novels written sort of 100 years ago, I would say, sort of where my genre is right now.
And are we reading them in the physical material form, or are we
Yes.
reading them not digitally?
Yes, reading them as an actual material book, usually with a pen in hand to take notes in the. So I even with novels or poetry or anything of the like, I will have a pen in my hand while I'm reading the book in case I'm inspired to write something down.
And on to the second part of your response. This is a very big theme here. As I mentioned to you before we started recording, I live down the street, literally 100 yards from the consulate here, which is allegedly the second biggest US embassy or consulate in the world. It's huge, and it deals with 2,500 visa applicants a day. And most days I see folks standing opposite it when it can be extremely hot here in Guadalajara, when there can be massive storms, but most of the time extremely hot. And the only shelter provided is trees surrounding a Walmart.
Mm. It's quite an image.
Quite an image. And then if you go to the side of the consulate, there are more trees for cover next to a very large statue in the form of the word love, per the cover of the book Love Story.
Hmm.
This is US imperialism in its
Yeah.
accidentally canniest. But in terms of folks, and there are many here that one meets who are undocumented, they're experiencing very hard times. And one of the interesting subsets of that I only recently found out, you may know, is that the wealthy children of the narcos, who in the past would go to university in Western Europe or the US, don't do that anymore.
Hmm.
They go to the tech,
Mm-hmm.
which is where I am, or they go to a front for Opus Dei,
Mm.
or they go to other private schools, but they're not leaving Mexico for higher education because despite their wealth and power, the ill-gotten gains, they rightly regard themselves as serious targets for this administration.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm a migrant many times over. I consider myself immensely fortunate to be allowed to live in and work in Mexico. But I see enormous suffering here among migrants from Central America, from Cuba, and so on. But nothing can compare, it seems to me, to the state terrorism that we're witnessing in the United States. So I wondered if you could tell us about your op-ed and tell us about what you're experiencing in the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the op-ed actually follows a group, a therapeutic community that is widespread. It started in Mexico and it's widespread in the United States. And it essentially is comprised by and for undocumented Mexicans, although there are other people that also are part of this group. And one of the things that they're called grupos de cuarto quinto paso, fourth and fifth step groups. And they are a kind of an offshoot of Alcoholics Anonymous, but they engage with the fourth and fifth steps of the 12 steps in order to for people to experience some kind of healing or rupture in their daily life. And so I followed one of these groups on what they called an experiencia, an experience, which is the sort of ritual bedrock of this organization, I guess we could call it, given how widespread it's become and how some of its practices have become codified over the years. So I followed one of these groups to the forest in Northern California, where for 3 nights and 4 days I engaged in this experiencia. And the heart of the experience is a nightly writing practice where the people that are a part of this journey are basically prompted to respond in various ways to a set of questions. And a lot of the questions, so I participated in this. I did the full experiencia as a participant and not an observer, which is what anthropologists generally are observing while participating. But it was very clear that the padrino or the director of this experience wanted me to be a full-on participant. And I was, but of course, I couldn't help but see what was around me. And what I saw were um, undocumented people, mostly Mexican, mostly young adults, but some older people too, who were seeking refuge from the constant uh, anxiety and agony of wanting of the question of safety. Will they be safe today? Can they go to work today? What will they confront today? And so the journey to the forest for those 4 nights was an escape into a kind of another life, another realm. And I saw both the incredible relief that people felt to be together in this, really beautiful landscape, but also the incredible uh, anxiety that they felt as well. Terrible anguish of having lost people to drug-related violence, criminal violence in Mexico, being concerned about family left home, being concerned about their ability to continue to work. I mean, just on and on and on. And all of this sort of took place in this lush forest in Northern California. So my piece is about this growing movement of undocumented people who are making this journey to the forest in order to relieve themselves of the kind of continuously haunting anxieties of everyday life living under the Trump administration. And so it's a unique setting from which to think about the kinds of turmoil and hardships that undocumented people face, and also the incredible systems of support that they've created for themselves and for their communities as they, try to live a life in a country that has made very clear, at least the president and the administration, that they are not wanted, that they are in fact despised. And so I saw people both grappling with the incredible beauty of place, which harkened back for many of them to indigenous towns in Michoacan and forests in Mexico where they remember living as children before coming to the United States, or grandparents living in rural areas. And so there was a lot of memory making during this experiencia. But I was really, so the piece, it's actually not quite an op-ed. It's a 3,000 word sort of longer feature story, but it's about these experiences that undocumented people go on and the kinds of issues that they bring with them, and then the kind of catharsis that they undergo. That is, I would call a kind of relational catharsis because it happens in relation to others. And then finally, their journey back home to Oakland, to San Francisco, to Redwood City, wherever they may be from. And then once again, having to sort of disappear into the shadows because of their undocumented status, while nevertheless having to get up every day and go to work, at the car wash, at the restaurant, as a day laborer, or whatever it may, as a domestic, whatever it may be. And so these experiencias that are held weekly uh, to service the many, many groups that exist in the Bay Area that I know of. There are 23 of these grupos de Cuarto Quinto Paso in the Bay Area alone. So it's a very large constituency of people that are being served by and that are participating in this therapeutic community. Um, to me, it's a space from which to think about sort of the trials and tribulations of undocumented people living today, and the great lengths that they will go to in order to try to undergo something a little bit like healing from the constant anxiety of what it is to live here, but also the anxiety of family left back home in Mexico or in El Salvador, to a certain extent. Honduras. I've met a lot of Hondurans who are a part of this community now too. So that's what I've just written, and we'll see where it goes. It was a piece for the New York Times, and we'll see if they take it or not.
Wonderful. And thanks for giving us a snapshot in
Yeah.
advance. This relates somewhat to other work you've done on los anexos,
Mhm.
both here in Mexico and in the United States. Here in the Global South, we have limited access, especially to books in English. So I've not read your book, but wonderfully, a lot of the things you've produced are available free online. So I've read a fair bit of your ethnographic work on them. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about Los Anexos, but also the controversy that attends them,
Mm.
massive controversy. And there's a
Yes.
kind of cosmic ambiguity, I think, in the way you describe them.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, so annexos literally are annexes. That's the translation into English, and they are usually one or two rooms, often in multifamily dwellings. I studied them primarily in Mexico City, although I did also spend some time in Oaxaca, Chihuahua, a few other states to look at annexos there, and they're quite diverse, but they share a number of features, and they're for people living with ostensibly problems with drugs or alcohol or mental health issues, and they are these essentially rooms where individuals are committed, usually by family members, um, for it could be 3 months, it could be 3 years. One never really knows how long it's going to be, where they are coercively committed to these places ostensibly for the purpose of recovery, some kind of recovery. And these are places that are run by lay people. There are no working professionals in them. They're pretty shabby, places by what was sort of in relation to what we might imagine a clinic looking like. They tend to be old apartment buildings or rooms above that sit above another a ground floor space, and they're stuffed with people. And when I say stuffed, I mean quite literally, one room will have, between 30 to 50 people, depending on the size. And these are all young men and women, primarily men, but also women, who are committed by usually nervous mothers, fearful mothers who are afraid that their children will be um, hurt by neighborhood or criminal violence and may be involved in the drug trade on some level. But that's actually something I never asked anybody, are you involved in the drug trade? Some of whom are clearly dealing with drug uh, abuse issues. But generally, what I found over the course of 10 years of researching Anexos is primarily these have become spaces of refuge for people who are at risk of the deadly violence surrounding the narco war. And they tend to be, as I mentioned, young men and young women. I've studied a number of annexos that are for women only, that are run by and for women. The people that run annexos generally have been in annexos themselves, so they graduate from an anexado, or someone who's annexed, to a padrino or a madrina, someone who runs these spaces. And so I followed their journeys. I followed the proliferation of anexos across different neighborhoods in Mexico City, but also the proliferation of anexos in the United States. One thing that anexos do both in Mexico and in the US is they service people, they care for people, albeit controversially, but people who are generally don't have access to professional health care of any sort. So these are really places run by and for the informal working poor. And the idea behind them is to provide safety and recovery. But in fact, a lot of the tactics and practices that Anexos employ mimic the kinds of violence that people are being supposedly protected from. So, for example, in order to get into an anexo, people are usually kidnapped. And this is a service provided by the anexo for a fee that usually a mother or a father, but usually a mother, will pay for, and their loved one is absconded in the middle of the night in a very frightening way, driven around for hours in order to induce anxiety and a sense of confusion, and then thrown into one of these rooms where they stay for an indefinite period of time. And so, one of the things that I've been very interested in is Anexos utilization of violence as a kind of deterrent for violence and a sort of an opening for these kind of quote unquote recovery projects. They're very controversial. They have been, there have been at various points in earlier administrations, not since Scheinbaum has been elected that I'm aware of, but there have been attempts to shut down Anexos, but they just, will pay a bribe and stay open and continue to operate quite openly. Um, and there are public health officials in Mexico estimate that in Mexico City alone, there are anywhere between 5,000 and 7,000. No one really knows because they're unregulated. Because they're unregulated, they kind of fly beneath the radar, and it's unknown how many there actually are. But I can say from experience that in the neighborhoods that I worked in, on one block, there could be upwards of a dozen, and all of them usually in these multi-family dwellings, where one of the units will be dedicated to locking up people who are at risk of violence or who have also perpetrated violence. Um, and in these spaces, violence is used as a therapeutic modality. So that tension between escaping violence, providing a refuge from violence, but then also perpetuating violence was something that I was very interested in. And I observed the proliferation of anexos over the course of a 10-year period that roughly aligns with the intensification of the narco war. So I became interested in the factors that are fueling the proliferation of these spaces and the way in which treatment has the way treatment looks, the way it's experienced has shifted over time and has become more intensified. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Human rights organizations have called for the closure of all anexos. There have been special issues of major medical journals that have also called for the closure of anexos or any kind of coercive addiction treatment facility. Although we have them too in the United States, coercive addiction facilities. They're usually jails and prisons. But in Mexico, they tend to be anexos. And so that is what my research has been focused on for the past decade.
And a little bit of context for people, it's obviously in the same light as your uncertainty about statistics, a guess, but most credible estimates suggest that half the labor force in Mexico is in the informal sector.
Yeah,
And this is part of that informal sector.
absolutely.
Yeah, fair to
It's
say.
part of the informal sector, and it's a part of a long-standing tradition of mutual aid among people who live in that sector, who live and work and
Right.
survive in that sector. So one of the things that I do is I try to trace this as being a part of a longer tradition of mutual aid. Although these places, they are for profit, so there is a nominal fee for keeping family members, inside of them. I have seen some padrinos make a very nice life for themselves in running these anexos, but most of them really remain committed to a kind of mutual aid philosophy where people who are brought into these places, if they don't have money to pay the monthly fee, which is usually how people remain in them. A family member pays monthly or weekly. If they're unable to do that, I've seen the exchange of labor. I've seen different ways that family have negotiated, bartered, in order to keep their relatives, quote unquote, safe within an anexo. So they emerge, so they definitely are servicing the informal working poor, and they definitely emerge from this long tradition of mutual aid within that community. But they're highly controversial. And in fact, the final chapter of, I believe it was the final chapter of my book on anexos, it's called The Gray Zone. And it's me trying to reckon with what is it that I actually have been witnessing for the past 10 years? Is it a form of care or is it mere coercion and violence? And I come up with an answer toward the end, which is maybe a little bit of an easy answer, and it's that they are both things. They are places of care and recovery and safety. At the same time, they bring with them a lot of baggage, and they also exacerbate certain violences that we know are very prevalent in Mexico today. And a lot of those forms of violence, are uh, related to criminal networks. And indeed, there have been some people that have said, anexos are part of these larger criminal organizations. And I doubt that. I mean, I imagine that that is likely true for some. The places that I worked in were much more kind of mom and pop style annexos, run by people living within these, multifamily dwellings and wanting a space within them where they could essentially hold relatives who were at risk of either death or disappearance.
Well, if they're not part of criminal networks, I would be pretty sure they're paying protection. And,
Oh, absolutely. That they are.
and as for your conclusion to the book, which I've not read, but which you've described, one could say that's a Palo Alto conclusion, but
Yes.
I don't think it is, or if it is, it's something else as well. It's a Mexican conclusion.
Mhm.
It's both and rather than either or. And by the way, folks, the title of the prof's book is The Way That Leads Among the Lost, Life, Death, and Hope in Mexico City's Anexos. I wanted to ask you a question about Iztapalapa,
Mhm.
which is one of the places where you encountered Anexos, maybe one of your first experiences, I'm guessing,
Yes,
which
it
you've
was.
written about very movingly. It's a part of Mexico City that I know pretty well. And it is what white people would call dodgy.
Mhm.
It's quite scary. It's quite dangerous. And you write very movingly of the guy who's driving you, taking you there and saying, are you sure you want to do this?
Mhm.
And you're saying yes. And then it's turning out that he's actually very involved in the place and has quite a lot of status. But as you enter it, you get a pretty frosty reception.
Mhm.
So I wanted to ask you how that turned into a decade of familiarity with the Anexos, how, in a sense, you got inside, if I can use that expression.
Yeah, no, I got inside in some sense by accident in a way. I went to Mexico City to study something entirely different. I had just finished a book on heroin addiction in northern New Mexico, which is where I'm from originally. And I wanted to get away from the theme of drugs and addiction and family violence and the kinds of things that I wrote about in my first book. So I went to Mexico City and to study the development of a kind of a mega project, Health City, it was going to be called. And this major mixed use project that would bring together luxury apartments with, cutting edge research facilities and shopping and, just it's a kind of a dream, a utopian, uh, but though commercial, that never materialized. And But I was studying this at the time in which I believed that it was going to be built. And the chauffeur who I sometimes hired to take me around Mexico City, asked me what I was studying. And I told him, and he said to me, "This will never happen. This will never be built, this biometropolis." And he was right. And he said, and I said to him, "Well, in my previous research, I worked on addiction." And he was like, "Okay, let's talk about addiction." And he told me the thing that does exist in Mexico are these things called anexos. And so he took me to my first anexo and actually became somewhat of an initial research assistant, helping me connect with padrinos of various anexos, men whom he knew from having worked in construction, earlier iterations of his life before he became a driver. He knew this one padrino who was my first connect in the world of anexos. And the anexo was in Iztapalapa and a very kind of working class. It was more, I mean, so I've certainly passed through parts of that borough that are very disconcerting, and I've always been relieved to be in a private car when driving through, to be honest. But that said, the neighborhood that we actually entered was, a working class neighborhood, not unlike some of the neighborhoods that I've seen in Los Angeles, where I lived for a period. Really vibrant, neighborly, um, and people out on the street cooking, selling, you know, a kind of very lively space and not at all scary. That said, when I was taken into the Annexo for the first time, I was astonished by what I found, by what confronted me. I was looked upon with great suspicion. Who was this, American woman coming to, people just weren't used to visitors to these places. And I think my longstanding interest and close relationship to questions of addiction and experiences of addiction was one way in which I was welcomed into this world because I was, in a sense, very much an outsider, but I also had, longstanding addiction issues within my own family. I could really understand what people were going through to a certain extent. And people looked at me initially as a doctor. The padrinos would say, refer to, Angela as Dr. Garcia. And so for a while, I was mistaken for an actual doctor, and people would come to me with their problems, and I would say, "No, no, no, I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm a professor," which is kind of a meaningless distinction at this point. But I was over time welcomed into these spaces. I became a regular in a sense. I kept showing up, and when people realized I was not easily gotten rid of, they began to talk to me about their lives. And that's, anthropology, we like to think of our methodology, or at least some of us, as a form of deep hanging out. And I was hanging out and I wouldn't leave. And I was very persistent because I very much wanted to understand, not only why these places existed, but how they worked. And I wanted to know the stories of the people that were caught within these spaces, literally caught, and how they managed to live together under really dire circumstances, and what it was their families, their mothers in particular, were trying to protect them from, and the kind of ethical wager that women and mothers had to undergo in order to decide, yes, I'm going to work more to get a little bit of money every month to hold my child in a place that I know is abusing him, but it's still better than my child living in the kind of outside in the free community, as sometimes it was called. And so I found in these annexos, I think, a really fascinating critical lens onto contemporary Mexican society. And so I stuck with them for 10 years. And the book actually does have, for better or for worse, an element of memoir, which goes into really the reasons why I became so passionate and fixated on anexos. So it sort of looks at my own childhood, my own adolescence and teenage years, because many of the people in these places are teenagers, and the kinds of, you know, um, the surprising moments of connection that I felt with a lot of the young anexados, especially the young women that I met, that kept me coming back for years. And I'm still in connection with a lot of them. I WhatsApp on a daily basis some of the anexados, some of the padrinos and madrinas that I met over the years. And I go back to Mexico City at least 3 times a year. Um, and I always find myself back in these places. I can't quite escape them myself.
Interesting side note for people. The Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana has a campus in Iztapalapa,
Mhm.
and its anthropology department is one of the best going. And a couple of my friends who work there, who are indigenous anthropologists, live in Iztapalapa. My other friends arrive in cars and don't get out of the cars except on the grounds of the campus.
Yeah.
On this score, Prof, of your own family, though as I've not read the book, as I said, I have read a very moving essay you published about you and your mom talking about her sister.
Hmm.
And I hope you don't mind my raising that, but I found it a wonderful piece of prose. And I wondered if you might share a little bit of that with us, because I think it does give a little bit of contour to your ongoing commitment.
Yeah. Yeah, my mother's sister, my aunt, was a heroin addict, and heroin is a very serious problem among Mexican Americans in New Mexico, which we call the Hispano community, which is where my roots are. And she was a junkie, and actually a number of people in my family, but my aunt in particular was my mother's, beloved sister. And my mother got to a point where, after trying for years and years to take care of my aunt, to try to get her to get clean, to bathe her, to house her, to feed her, um, she gave up, and she my aunt ended up dying of a heroin overdose. And my mother asked me, basically whether or not she felt that she had betrayed her sister. But what I try to show in this piece are really the limits of care, the point at which a family member gives up. And yet the ongoing, uh, in the case of my mother, her ongoing despair and really self-loathing that she's experienced in giving up, and the constant, wondering, could I have done more? Should I have done more? What happened to her in her final, months and days? Where was she? Who was she with? These questions, and those are questions that animate so many of the women that I met in Mexico, that were deeply concerned about usually the disappearance of their kids. And for my mother, she felt that her sister had disappeared, but had disappeared through her addiction. And she felt that she not only couldn't protect her, but more importantly, in the end, didn't protect her, no longer tried. And so I've become very interested in the kind of the threshold, the point at which a person decides, I'm done, I've done enough, I can't do anymore. But then the ongoing, lingering doubt that attends that posture. And so I write about my mom. The book is dedicated to my mother, and I write a lot about my mother in the book and my relationship with my mother, which is a very complex one. Um, And I, my mother is the one sibling in her, her brothers and sisters that did not become addicted to heroin. She has her own addiction issues, but she was not addicted to heroin. And so I grew up in a setting of widespread drug use and drug problems. And I think that intimate knowledge with that aspect of the drug world is part of what enabled me to stay close to my interlocutors in Mexico City. They knew that I understood something about drugs and addiction, and um, they kept me close and to the point where at one point during my field research, I became very, very ill. And I was still doing work. I was working in an anexo, doing observations and some interviews, and everyone could tell I was incredibly sick. And the padrino of the place called his driver. There's a lot of drivers. There's a lot of people driving people around, and to call his driver to drive me back to from Iztapalapa to where I was living in another neighborhood, a very different neighborhood, Roma Norte, and took me home. But on the way home, stopped off at a market and bought me all of these herbs and took me home and made me a tea. And I wasn't used to these sort of small acts of kindness. And I certainly wasn't prepared to receive such an act from a man who was a kind of scary looking dude. He was a kind of very intimidating. But he ended up being one of the most uh, sort of, there was something very delicate about him at the same time. The way he made the tea, I remember being feverish and watching him and thinking he must have watched his mother do this, or maybe he did this for his grandmother. And so he prepared this tea for me. And I'm just mentioning this because this was a moment that shattered for me a stereotype that I had had about these sort of a certain kind of class of man who are, are very much sort of working class, but also questionable in terms of, what do they actually do for a living? Um, there's a degree of shadiness in all of these places and with all of, most of the people that I came to know, but I was used to that already. I became used to that as a young person, as a very young person. And so it was relatively, although shocking initially, and people were sort of like, who the hell are you and why are you here? Because I was so obviously not from these neighborhoods. And I was obviously an outsider. Nevertheless, over time, as people got to know me and as I kept coming back day after day, they began to open up. And then they began to care for me, such as in this one instance that I describe, of like a real generosity of care. So I saw that alongside all of these other very troubling things, the kidnappings, the making people kneel on their knees with outstretched arms for multiple hours a day, the beatings that occasionally happen, the chaining some people to walls as a mode of discipline, a lot of very troubling things, this constant psychological and verbal abuse. At the same time that was happening, something else was occurring, and I really needed to try to understand the intersection of care and violence in these spaces.
Now, the kneeling with the arms outstretched brings me inevitably onto the subject of religion. And for my last question, I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. I'll give some more context for people first. And then once you've answered that query, offer you the chance, should you wish, to add anything. And the anything might be terrain we've already traversed, but where I missed something in my questions, or something entirely new that we didn't discuss. Does that sound okay as a means of concluding affairs? So the thing about religion for people outside this world, this remains a very Catholic country, but like Brazil, like lots of Chicanos, Chicanas in LA, it's seen a lot of evangelical Protestantism, much of our evangelical Protestantism fueled by vast amounts of money from really crazy right-wing people in the United States. But it can be ambivalent. And I'm thinking of here, Alcoholics Anonymous, and I don't know whether that applies to Los Anexos, but where some of evangelical Christianity, despite its notion of, in a sense, reasserting hegemonic masculinity, reasserting the primacy of the male in the heterosexual family, also insists this means don't get drunk, don't get high, don't attack your wife, don't attack your children. To be a real male leader, and this sort of concept is never problematized, means not being violent with those you love. So I wanted to ask you about that religious element and my little characterization thereof.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. Mexico remains, very much a Catholic country, but in recovery movements, you do see the reach of evangelical Christianity as being like, particularly, I spent some time in Guatemala. Almost all of the equivalent of anexos there are run by evangelical churches. What I found in Mexico is quite different, however. These places remain, kind of embrace a mode of popular Catholicism, kind of working class Catholicism, I guess you could call it. I grew up a kind of working class Catholic, so I resonated a lot with some of the, daily um, traditions, and I so they remain very every in all of the annexos I studied, there was something called study hour where we would read from the Bible. And a lot of people couldn't read, and this became an opportunity for them to learn how to read. Or people sometimes over the years that they were there seemed like they forgot how to read. So it was always very ambiguous, these study hours, but we would read passages from the Bible, and then there would be, prayer services. The prayers were always, Catholic prayers that I remember growing up, and what I described, the kneeling on the ground with the arms outstretched. That is a posture that one could say is very Catholic in nature. You could imagine that it's perhaps Jesus on the cross. So there were these forms of bodily comportment that were cultivated that had very strong Catholic sensibility. And there were always a lot of saints in the corner of the room, like a little altar with saints. Lots of pictures of Jesus along with the founders of AA on the wall. And I think what is really key to the Catholic nature of these groups is the emphasis on something called desagüe, or a kind of draining session, which is actually more of a confessional practice, where people are made to confess in ways that are very moving, but also it's a kind of coercive confession. So there's an element of coercion that accompanies it, as confession often has an element of coercion in it. But these are unlike the groups that I studied in Guatemala City. These are definitely Catholic in orientation, although there are others that are not. So I visited a couple in Chihuahua that evangelicals, and I wondered if, because it was in Chihuahua, more the northern border, whether this is something I have a research assistant looking into, whether the annexos there are predominantly evangelical, or whether they are, similarly as they were in Mexico City, predominantly Catholic in orientation. And there have even been some of the nexos that I visited where a local priest will come and do blessings of the space. And so they're really these hybrid institutions. They function even as a kind of church space for people that are there. Sundays are the days where some family members would be able to come visit their loved ones. And there would often be like a prayer service or something of that nature on Sunday visit days. So they're Catholic, they're complicated, and as Catholicism is, but they are very much this hybrid of what I call sort of prison, home, church, hospital, clinic. They are all of those things at once. Um, and so that's one of the things that I look at quite in depth in the book. Um, Also, the way they've peeled away from traditional 12-step programs and really emphasize steps 4 and 5, making of a fearless inventory of oneself and confessing one's wrongdoings to another. So in anexos, the emphasis on steps 4 and 5 of the 12 steps are really, those are the foundational steps and that people practice during their stay in an annexo. So I would say that that kind of covers the religious element. I wrote a piece that was published in the American Ethnologist called The Confessional Community, which really goes more deeply into the Catholic roots of these places.
And I
And there
can
was a
say that,
second part.
that's available
Yeah.
freely online, by the way.
Oh, great.
I mean, I
Great.
don't know whether, I was in El Sector Informal when I found it, but
That's fine. Yes. And I'll send you a PDF of the book so you have that.
Prof, to conclude matters, is there anything you'd like to add? As I said, it could be something entirely new, or it might be something that touches on terrain we've covered.
I guess what I'll add is that these spaces are only going to continue to proliferate with the relentless insecurity that so many Mexicans, but also people in this country, I'm seeing them proliferate in Los Angeles, where I do research, in San Antonio, in parts of Texas, where there's a saying, "Donde hay mexicanos hay anexos." Where there are Mexicans, there are anexos, and I have found that to be true in the U.S. And so I'm looking at what are the issues that Anexos in the US vis-a-vis Mexico are addressing. And one of the key issues that's being addressed in the Anexos that I work on in the US um, is PTSD and anxiety and these mental health disorders that stem from sort of traumatic migrant journeys, from the constant sort of deportability that people are that confront in their daily lives, their the likelihood of being deported or their fear of being deported or detained. And Nexus in the US are grappling with the psychological abuse that undocumented people are living under, the constant duress. And in Mexico, anexos are sites that are protecting people from the risk of disappearance, which is one of the key concerns that families have with their young people who who may have gotten involved in local gangs or criminal networks. So both sites, the U.S. and Mexico, have these facilities, have these spaces, but they are serving very different kinds of issues. And those issues provide insight into, the daily hardships that Mexicans in Mexico and that Mexicans in the U.S. confront.
Prof. Garcia, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. It's been fantastic listening to you, learning from you, sharing things with you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your time as well.